I stand today to speak to the opposition day motion that, as Liberals, we put forward. And clearly, when we look at this most recent budget from the Conservative government and associated legislation, the Conservatives have proposed drastic cuts to essential services and legislation that protects Canadian citizens, including to Canada's food safety infrastructure, public health, environmental protection, and public safety. Conservatives argue that the money will be saved by finding efficiencies and deny the drastic measures they are taking will put the health and safety of Canadians at risk. Now, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to read that because, to me, I find it just impossible to understand how the government can cut an entity like a search and rescue facility and not see the danger inherent in that. In fact, if you look at the Maritime Rescue Subcentre in St. John's, Newfoundland, and the 12 employees that are there, and the number of lives that have been saved as a result of their work, in fact, we're talking about 600 lives annually saved as a result of the work that's been done, where they've helped taken part in rescue missions. How can you not understand or see that by cutting the Maritime Rescue Centre and the service that it provides, that lives are going to be lost? And that's what's so serious about this. We have both a Maritime Rescue Subcentre in Quebec and we have one in Newfoundland and Labrador in St. John's. Now, when you look at what's going on in Quebec, we're seeing that they've been giving 1 year's reprieve. And of course, that has to do with the language issue. And that's perfectly understandable. In fact, it isn't a reprieve they need, Mr. Speaker. They need to ensure that that centre doesn't close at all. And the same is true for St. John's. And we can point to example after example of where lives have been saved, where people will say and give sworn testimony that if it wasn't for the Maritime Rescue Subcentre in St. John's, Newfoundland, that in fact their lives would have been lost. And that is what is so fearful here. They're suggesting that they're going to save $1 million by closing down the subcentre in St. John's, making it part of the Joint Rescue Centre in Halifax and the one in Trenton, and they're going to save $1 million. We'll talk about putting a price on lives, Mr. Speaker, and that is what is so serious about this. The centre should not be closing, and what I don't understand is that we have the Auditor General who is going to report in the spring of 2013 on search and rescue. Why is the government at this point in time moving ahead? Why are they not waiting until we get the report from the Auditor General, an independent party, someone who's going to look at this from a nonpartisan view and get again his recommendation with respect to search and rescue, instead of taking the chance, closing down a life-saving centre like the Maritime Rescue Subcentres in both provinces in Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador, and end up with the possible loss of lives. And no matter who you talk to, it is just not conceivable that there will not be loss of lives, because we know how dangerous it is to work on the ocean. We know in Newfoundland and Labrador how volatile the conditions can be when you're out working on the ocean. And this just doesn't apply to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. This applies to people who are working in the offshore industry, who are from all parts of the world. This applies to people who travel on Marine Atlantic, who are from all parts of this world. This applies to people in the fishery. It applies to anybody who's on a ocean-going vessel, who's trading product from other parts of the world. So it isn't just a Newfoundland and Labrador issue. This is an issue that impacts all Canadians, but it also impacts people in other parts of this world. So that's one aspect of what is so serious about the cuts that this government is making to essential services. Then we look at what's happening with respect to the hosing down of the vehicles in Port aux Basques and in Argentia. Again, both ports in Newfoundland. And the vehicles need to be hosed down because, Mr. Speaker, the soil in Newfoundland is contaminated. In fact, it has what's called the potato wart, and it has potato cyst nematode. And the problem we have is that if that contaminated soil leaves Newfoundland and Labrador, just to give you an example, it can ruin the potato crop in Prince Edward Island. It can ruin the potato crop in New Brunswick, something that nobody wants to see happen. And we had an incident several years ago, Mr. Speaker, where that very thing happened, in fact. Because the contaminated soil got to PEI, the U.S. stopped importing potatoes from PEI for a period of time. We don't need to see this happen. You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. And for the sake of what? How much money are they saving by refusing to continue to do the hosing down of these vehicles? Now, interesting enough, the government has said it's still going to continue, but they're not going to take responsibility for it. Well, Mr. Speaker, who has responsibility for the safety of the food that Canadians consume and other people consume if it isn't the federal government? They are saying that, yes, the vehicles will have to continue to be hosed down, and they use a power hose, Mr. Speaker, to do this. They're inspected and then they're hosed down to ensure that the contaminated soil doesn't leave Newfoundland and Labrador. But if the government is going to stop taking responsibility for that, whose responsibility does it then become? They made reference to the private sector. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, but I would like to think that governments would take responsibility for food, not leaving it to the private sector in terms of the safety of the food that we are eating. So here we have a handful of jobs. That's what it is, Mr. Speaker. You've got 4 jobs in Port aux Basques, you've got 2 in Argentia, and the government is saying, sorry, but those jobs are not going to exist because we don't need you to do that anymore. I don't understand, Mr. Speaker, how the government can possibly look at this and consider it a cost savings, something that they need to do, or anything of the magnitude that they need to deal with their deficit. There are so many other measures that they can take. In fact, when you look at the building of mega prisons, when you look at this whole idea of giving corporations tax breaks, well, you know, there's a time for everything. And if you're going to give wealthy corporations a tax break, absolutely, there's nothing wrong with profit, Mr. Speaker. But at the end of the day, there's a time to do it, and how much. And this is not the time to do it, especially if, on the other hand, you have to cut jobs like those at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Those jobs that are so important. These are in rural communities, by the way. Port aux Basques and Argentia are 2 rural communities. Do you know how important those handful of jobs are in those rural communities? It's the same as if you were talking about 1,000 jobs in a larger community. These are well-paying jobs that need to stay in those communities for the very reason that it ensures the safety of the food that Canadians will eat. Mr. Speaker, I remember when the budget was brought in and they talked about the 19,200 jobs that were going to be lost. And they were saying, you know, that maybe 7,000 would be through attrition, 7,000 or 8,000 would be through attrition. That still means, Mr. Speaker, that there are about 13,000 jobs that are going to be cut. If you're going to cut that many jobs, you are going to impact services. There is no doubt about it. And you're going to impact essential services. And to suggest that the majority of those jobs will be cut from the center, for example, from Ottawa, is foolhardy. We know differently. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we are seeing today jobs being cut not just from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, not just from the Maritime Rescue Subcentre, but we're seeing jobs cut from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Let me give an example, Mr. Speaker. Fishers who need to renew their license. A lot of these fishers don't own computers. A lot of these fishers don't even know how to access the internet. So what do? They go into the rural offices where there is someone at the counter, it's a counter front service, who will take their money, help them apply for their license, and off they go. It's easy. It's a service, among other services that that frontline individual provides. But, Mr. Speaker, no, we are saying you have to go online. We are not going to provide that service anymore. A service, one job in a rural community, again, very important to that rural community, but also very important to the people who avail of that service. We are seeing cuts to Service Canada. We are seeing cuts to Environment Canada. Everywhere you look, we are seeing cuts. and all in the name of dealing with a deficit that was brought on by this government when they knew better, Mr. Speaker, and now Canadians are having to pay the price.